Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive? Today, we've got a story that's, well, it's both hilarious and kind of thought-provoking at the same time.
Oh, I'm intrigued.
So, picture this. A king, right? Living the good life, spoiled, used to everything being perfect, and then suddenly there's this awful smell in his castle.
Uh-oh, that's never good.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
And of course, who does he blame?
The servants, probably.
Exactly. The poor servants are scrubbing, airing out the place, doing everything they can think of, but nothing works.
So what's the source of the stink? Don't leave us hanging.
Well, that's the funny part. It's the king himself. He's having some, shall we say, accidents.
Oh, dear.
Yeah, not exactly a regal situation.
Yeah.
And the servants, they're terrified to tell him the truth. Can you imagine?
I can't even imagine having to tell my boss something like that, let alone a king.
Right. But it makes you think, how often does something like this happen in real life? People in power, completely oblivious to their own, well, you know.
Blind spots.
Yeah, blind spots.
Yeah.
Because everyone around them is too afraid to speak up.
It's like that saying, the emperor has no clothes.
Exactly. And that actually brings us to the next part of the story. One of the servants, a clever guy, remembers that story about the emperor, and he thinks, maybe I can use that to subtly hint to the king.
Oh, this is good.
Right. So he arranges for the king to take a walk through town, figuring maybe a child will be, brutally honest.
So like a reverse psychology kind of thing.
Exactly. But of course, it backfires spectacularly. A kid points out the king's issue right there in front of everyone.
And the king's reaction?
Well, he doesn't exactly have a moment of self-awareness. He throws a tantrum, banishes the poor servant, the whole 9 yards.
So much for subtle hints.
Right. It shows you how sometimes even the best intentions can completely blow up in your face.
Especially when you're dealing with someone who's, let's say, a bit sensitive about their image.
Exactly. So now things are even worse. Right?
Yeah.
The king is still, well, smelly, and he's lost one of his most trusted advisors. And that's when the chef steps in. Bless his heart, he decides to take a different approach.
Let me guess. He tries to cover up the smell.
In a way, yes. He figures if they can't stop the accidents, maybe they can make the consequences a little less noticeable.
Okay, I'm curious. What does he do?
He comes up with this whole special diet for the king, designed to, well, make things less fragrant.
Interesting. So like internal deodorant.
Something like that. But here's the catch. The food is so bland, so awful, that even the king refuses to eat it.
So much for that plan.
Yep, back to square one. But wait, it gets even better. Just when you think things can't get any worse, this so-called expert arrives from a foreign land, claims he can solve the king's smelly little secret.
Oh no, I have a bad feeling about this.
You and me both. Because guess what? The expert himself has the same problem as the king.
You're kidding?
Nope, it's a classic case of the blind leading the blind.
Oh, this is going to be good. Or maybe not so good for the king.
You're telling me. This expert is a total charlatan. He spends a few weeks poking around the castle, making all sorts of wild accusations, pocketing a nice chunk of the king's gold. And then, at the first sign of real trouble, he disappears, vanishes, leaves the king to deal with the mess he's created.
Classic. So now the king is not only smelly, but he's also been swindled and abandoned. Talk about adding insult to injury.
It's a recipe for disaster. And speaking of disaster, remember how the king banished that wise servant earlier?
Oh, yeah.
Well, that decision comes back to bite him big time. Because now, with the kingdom weakened by all this internal chaos, guess what happens?
Someone decides to take advantage.
Bingo. A neighboring kingdom sees an opportunity and decides to invade.
So the king is now facing a full-blown crisis, and he's basically brought it on himself through his own denial and bad decisions.
It's a pretty rough situation. But you know what? Sometimes hitting rock bottom is what it takes for someone to finally see the light.
That sounds like a perfect segue to the next part of our story.
It is. But first, we need to take a quick break. We'll be back in a moment to see what happens when the king finally faces the truth and the consequences of his actions.
You know, it's funny, isn't it? I mean, this story, it's like a fairy tale, but it's got these parts that feel so real, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. The king refusing to see what's right in front of him, those poor servants too scared to speak up.
And then that expert just taking advantage of the whole situation.
It's like a playbook for how things go wrong, not just in kingdoms, but in companies, families, everywhere, really.
Exactly. It makes you wonder if we haven't all been a bit like that king sometimes. Maybe not, literally.
But yeah, maybe clinging to our own ideas a little too tightly, not wanting to see the flaws, even when they're, well, stinking up the place.
Stinking up the place. That's a good one. So what do you think? What's the big lesson here? I mean, for us, not just for fairy tale kings.
Well, I think it has to do with being willing to see our own blind spots.
Mm,
Like, we all have them.
right. Oh, for sure. It's just human nature.
Exactly. And so the trick is, how do we get better at spotting them? Because that's when we can actually start to fix things.
That's where feedback comes in, right? Being open to hearing what other people have to say, even if it's not what we want to hear.
Right. But it's got to be more than just listening. It's got to be about creating a space where people feel safe to speak up in the first place.
Oh, that's a good point. Because in the story, those servants, they knew what was going on, but they were too afraid to say anything.
Exactly. They were stuck in that power dynamic,
Mhm.
you know. The king's word was law, and they didn't want to risk the consequences.
And that happens all the time in the real world, too. Whistleblowers who risk everything to expose corruption, or people in abusive relationships who just feel trapped.
It's a tough situation. So how do we change that? How do we create environments where it's okay to speak truth to power, so to speak?
Well, I think it starts at the top. Leaders got to set the tone. They got to show that they're open to feedback, even criticism.
And not just say it, but really mean it.
Exactly. It's about walking the walk, not just talking the talk. And you know what else helps? Having ways for people to give feedback without fear of, getting in trouble.
Like anonymous surveys or suggestion boxes, things like that.
Right. Anything that gives people a voice without putting them on the spot.
But it's not just on the leaders, right? I mean, we all have a responsibility to speak up when we see something wrong.
Oh, absolutely. And to support those who are brave enough to speak truth to power, even when it's hard. Because let's be real, sometimes speaking up can have consequences.
Yeah, for sure. But I think in the long run, it's better than letting problems fester and grow, right? Like that smell in the castle, if they just addressed it head on.
Instead of trying to cover it up with fancy diets. But speaking of fresh starts, let's talk about the prince, shall we?
Yeah, because his arrival kind of changes everything, doesn't it? It's like a breath of fresh air, literally and figuratively.
Right. The king, after his moment of truth, decides to fight for his people, even though things look pretty bleak.
And just when he needs it most, the prince returns, ready to help.
And he's not just some spoiled kid either. He's been studying, learning about leadership, strategy.
He's the real deal. And you know what gets me? He doesn't try to do it all alone. He reaches out to those advisors who were banished, the ones who actually know what they're doing.
It's like he sees their value, even though his own father didn't.
Exactly. And the king, to his credit, he realizes he messed up big time.
Yeah.
He apologizes to his people, to his advisors, and then he does something really unexpected. He steps down from the throne.
Wow, that's a big deal. It's like he's finally learned that being a good leader isn't about holding on to power at all costs.
It's about knowing when to let go, when to trust others to take the reins. And that's how the kingdom is saved, right? The prince, with the help of those experienced advisors, they drive out the invaders, restore peace and prosperity.
And hopefully everyone learns a thing or two about honesty, humility, and not being afraid to call out a bad smell when they smell it.
Exactly.
It's amazing,
Yeah.
how this whole story, it started with the smelly king, and now we're talking about leadership and changing the world.
Right. It just goes to show you, sometimes the simplest stories can have the deepest lessons. So, for our listeners out there, what's the one thing you hope they take away from all this?
That's a good question. I think for me, it's the idea that change is always possible, even when things seem really messed up.
Like with the king, right? He made some terrible choices, but in the end, he was able to admit his mistakes and step aside for someone who could do a better job.
Exactly. And that took a lot of humility, letting go of that ego, that need to be in control all the time. That's what allowed the kingdom to actually heal and move forward.
It's a powerful message, especially these days when it seems like everyone's just looking out for themselves.
Yeah, no kidding. But this story shows us that there's another way, a way where we put the needs of others first, where we're willing to admit when we're wrong, and where we work together to make things better.
So let's say someone's listening to this right now and they're thinking, okay, that all sounds great, but how do I actually apply these lessons to my own life? What would you tell them?
Well, I think it starts with taking a good, hard look in the mirror. Ask yourself, am I really being honest with myself about my own weaknesses? Am I open to hearing feedback, even if it stings a little?
It's about being humble, right?
Yeah.
Knowing that we don't have all the answers.
Exactly. And realizing that we all have blind spots, those areas where our judgment might be clouded,
So how do we get better at seeing those blind spots? Because if we don't even know they're there, how can we fix them?
Well, one way is to surround ourselves with people who are different from us, people who have different experiences, different perspectives.
Because they can help us see things that we might miss on our own.
Right. It's like having extra sets of eyes, but not just any eyes. Eyes that see the world in a whole new way. And then it's about really listening to those people, not just waiting for your turn to talk, but actually trying to understand where they're coming from.
It's about being open-minded, even when it's hard.
Exactly. And remember, leadership isn't just about having a fancy title or being in charge of a bunch of people. It's about taking action, inspiring others, working together to make a difference.
So for all those folks out there who are ready to make a difference, what's one small step they can take today?
How about this? Next time you see something that's not right, speak up, even if it feels a little scary.
Or maybe reach out to someone who's struggling. Offer them a listening ear, a helping hand.
Exactly. Because even the smallest actions can have a ripple effect. You never know who you might inspire. And who knows, maybe if we all start doing these little things, we can create a world that's a little less smelly.
A world where honesty and humility are valued, where people feel safe to speak their minds, and where we all work together to create something better.
That sounds like a pretty great world to me.
Me too. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up our deep dive. Thank you so much for joining us today, and remember, even the smallest actions can make a big difference. So go out there and make the world a little less smelly, one step at a time.